Welcome to this lecture on the different ways of understanding the concept of revelation in Islam and how the Qur'an became a book shortly after the Prophet's death. We also explore the features of early and later verses of the Qur'an and the benefits of understanding the differences between the two types of verses. Let's begin. In this lecture, we will look at the concept of revelation in Islam and the Qur'anic texts in the Meccan and Medinan periods. The focus of this lecture is on three key points. First, to give you a sense of how Muslims understand the term revelation and whether revelation can be considered just the Quran or something more. Second, some of the Muslim discussions on how the Quran as revelation came about, the stages it went through, and how it became a book, and some of the developments in relation to the Arabic script of the text. Third, some of the characteristics of the Quran during the Prophet's time in Mecca, dividing that into early Meccan and late Meccan, and then the Prophet's time in Medina. Understanding whether certain parts of the Quran are from the early Meccan or late Meccan or Medinan helps us understand how the context was relevant to the content of the Quran. We will be looking at some of the characteristics of the Quranic texts in these different periods. Let us now look at the concept of revelation. What is meant by revelation? The term revelation is obviously an English. At a linguistic level, it may mean the divine or supernatural disclosure to humans of something relating to human existence or the world. But in the context of the Quran, we use it somewhat differently. In short, for our purposes, revelation is about God's sending down of his messages to a prophet or the actual messages sent by God, the act or the result of that act of God. The Arabic term for revelation is wahy, W-A-H-Y. The word revelation is commonly used by Muslims when they refer to Quranic texts. I am also following that convention in this lecture. Sometimes I use the term revelations, sometimes I use the term Quranic texts. The term Quranic texts is a more neutral term. For Muslims, the texts in the Quran are the actual messages sent from God to Prophet Muhammad in Arabic language. For Muslims, this is not about God revealing himself or his being. What is revealed is God's words or messages. For Muslims, God is not a being that has any physical or material characteristics. The idea that God is revealing himself or his being to anyone in this world is not something Muslim theologians accept or are comfortable with. In that sense, some Muslim theologians would say that God is completely unknowable. The idea is, as human beings, we have no direct experience of God, and therefore God is beyond human comprehension. So, whenever we use the term revelation, we are basically making reference to words or messages that are sent down to a prophet, or in this case, the Prophet Muhammad. There is a second English term that is often used in the context of revelation or as a translation of the Arabic word wahy, that is inspiration. Inspiration is more about non-verbal messages that can come to anyone, whereas revelation can be verbal or non-verbal and is more about the messages a prophet receives from God. A common belief among Muslims is that revealing or communicating messages by God to prophets in particular has been going on from the very beginning of humanity. The Quran says that God sent his messages to many prophets. So, in this sense, whatever messages any prophet may have received, whether those messages are documented in a book or a scripture or a written text or not, they would be considered revelation. Of course, for Muslims, when they use the term revelation, it immediately relates to the Quran first and foremost. But Muslims believe there are also other revelations. The most obvious ones are the revelations or messages the biblical figures such as Abraham, David, Moses, and Jesus had received. These are mentioned in the Quran a number of times. This idea that a revelation of God's messages began from the beginning of humanity and continues throughout history right up to Prophet Muhammad is a very strongly held belief among Muslims. In this sense, the Muslim understanding of revelation or communication from God to humanity is a very inclusive one. The messages Prophet Muhammad received become only one set of messages in a long series. There are two ways Muslims understand revelation: revelation which is recited and revelation which is not recited. What does this mean? For Muslims, revelation that is recited are the texts in the Quran. Observant Muslims recite parts of the Quran every day, most notably in their daily prayers, or in Arabic, salat. The performance of the Islamic prayer involves various movements and includes, importantly, recitation of parts of the Quran. The most obvious part of the Quran that they recite is chapter 1 of the Quran. This is the text of chapter 1 in translation. In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. Praise be to Allah, the Lord of the universe, the most gracious, the most merciful, Master of the day of judgment. You alone we worship, and from you alone we ask for help. Guide us to the straight path, the path of those on whom you have bestowed your grace, not of those who earned your wrath, nor of those who have gone astray. Outside these daily prayers, observant Muslims often recite various parts of the Quran as well, believing that reciting the Quran brings them closer to God and is a form of ritual that will be rewarded by God. Recitation of the Quran is seen as a form of spiritual healing as well. For many Muslims, when they feel helpless, depressed, or down, or in extreme difficulty, reading the Quran gives them comfort and can be a powerful form of healing for believers. What about revelation that is not recited? What is it? Very briefly, revelation that is not recited is what is referred to as hadith. Hadiths are sayings or deeds attributed to Prophet Muhammad. We will look at hadith shortly. If the Prophet says something about God or an ethical or religious matter, for example, which is not part of the Quran, the idea is that those sayings are also inspired by God, or in a sense, revealed by God. They are not messages that God sent down or revealed like the Quran. This is associated with the idea that the Prophet Muhammad, as a prophet, was guided by God to say the things he said and do the things he did. But what the Prophet said or did, as reported in the Hadith, are not part of the Quran. They are collected in various works or books called Hadith collections. Muslims do not necessarily recite the Hadith in the way they recite the Quran. They keep a clear distinction between the Quran and Hadith. The Quran is attributed to God, while the Hadith is attributed to Prophet Muhammad. Let me give An example: the Quran often says to Muslims, perform the prayer or salat. This is understood to be the 5 daily prayers, although the number 5 in relation to prayers is not mentioned in the Quran. The Quran doesn't actually give a lot of detail about how a Muslim should perform the prayers or what format to use. These details are provided in the hadith of the Prophet. So the details the Prophet provided in relation to the prayer are seen as inspired by God, but they are not part of the Quran. Here is a point of discussion among Muslims today. The issue is whether Muslims today can actually make a clear distinction between the Prophet's teachings as a prophet, but are not included in the Quran, and what the Prophet did in his ordinary life, just like any other human being in that society. The idea is that the Prophet's role as a prophet was more about theological, ritual, ethical, or spiritual matters, not so much about what many refer to as worldly matters. In other words, in relation to what the Prophet said or did, which part of that should a Muslim follow today? For example, if the Prophet used to wear certain types of clothes, should Muslims follow that today? If he had managed his community in a particular way, in a political or administrative sense, should Muslims follow the way he did that always? What do you think? We may come to this point in some other lecture. For the time being, give some thought to this issue. Let us focus on the revelations in a little bit more detail. What was the very first revelation or message the Prophet received? As we came across in the first lecture, according to Muslim tradition, the Prophet used to spend some quiet time in a cave outside Mecca. And it is in that cave in 610 of the Christian calendar, the Prophet is believed to have experienced a voice in the cave coming to him and asking him to read or recite. That is in 610. Over the next 22 years, the Prophet experienced many episodes of revelation or receiving of messages. A question often asked is, what was the nature of these messages? How did he experience revelation? An interesting point is that there are many different ways in which the Prophet may have experienced receiving of those messages. Let us look at one of the hadiths that gives us a sense of the kind of experience the Prophet appeared to have had with regard to revelation. Let us look at this hadith. Al-Harith ibn Hisham, who is one of the companions of the Prophet, that is one of the immediate followers of the Prophet, asked the Prophet, O Allah's Messenger, how is the revelation or wahi revealed to you? Allah's messengers replied, sometimes it is like the ringing of a bell. This form of revelation is the hardest of all, and then this state passes off after I have grasped what is revealed. Sometimes the angel comes in the form of a man and addresses me, and I grasp what he says. So, based on this hadith, when the Prophet Muhammad received these messages, he was not necessarily hearing the actual Arabic words from someone or something, but he was getting that, as he said, in the form of something like a ringing of a bell or a certain kind of sound. This probably is some kind of code or a mysterious system of signs that we are not familiar with. But the message in that code is then perhaps decoded and takes the form of Arabic language in the Prophet's mind. The Prophet says, then he grasps what was revealed. For us, it is of course difficult to give a detailed explanation of what is involved in this rather psychological experience. The second way in which the Prophet apparently received those messages based on this hadith is that an angel comes to him in the form of a man. and communicates the messages, presumably in Arabic language. And this form, the hadith says, is easier than the other experience of revelation. The generally accepted view among Muslims is that the bulk of the Quran was actually communicated to the Prophet via an angel, Gabriel, in the Arabic language. But the Quran seems to leave open the possibility that the Prophet may have received these messages from God directly or indirectly, perhaps sometimes in the actual Arabic language, and perhaps at other times in a code we don't know, but which the Prophet understands. The Quran makes the point that God revealed the Quran in Arabic language. I just wanted to mention this point because this relates to an old theological issue in Islam about God's speech and the nature of the Quran. And also because a number of contemporary Muslim scholars have attempted to provide a detailed explanation of this experience of revelation, which may not be in line with mainstream Muslim understandings of revelation. For our purposes in this lecture, what is important is the Quran as a text is out there, and that's what we will be dealing with. But it is good to know some of the debates among Muslims on these matters as well. Let us look at the issue of the otherness of the revelation. A related question is whether the Prophet made a clear distinction between what he was receiving as the Quran and his own thoughts. Islamic tradition holds that the Prophet made a very clear distinction between the two, and he strongly believed that the Quran was external to him. The Prophet believed he had no influence or control over the content of the message. The Quran makes this statement again and again, attributing the Quran to God, not to Prophet Muhammad. Let us look at what we might call the stages of revelation. According to Muslim tradition, the Quran went through different stages, from God as God's speech to what is in Islam called the preserved tablet, or Allahul Mahfuz in Arabic. We have no idea what this tablet is like. The Muslim belief is that it is some kind of a recording system in the heavens. That's how it is understood. Then from there, the Quran came to Prophet Muhammad as a series of messages, and then from Prophet Muhammad to his people, and later to the rest of humanity. This is a very brief way of conceptualizing how Muslims understand the revelation took place. Obviously, there are a lot of details. I have actually dropped some details here. This notion of stages of revelation is very familiar to Muslims. Prophet Muhammad communicated the messages he received in Arabic language to a community that actually excelled in Arabic expression. The Meccans and other Arabs prided themselves on being perfect communicators in Arabic with the best literary skills. Obviously, not all of them, but certainly quite a good number of them. At the time of the Prophet, obviously, many Meccans and others objected to his teachings and opposed the new religion. Many said Muhammad simply makes up these messages, or someone is teaching them to Muhammad. So, how did the Quran respond to those accusations? The Quran challenged the Meccans and said to them, if you doubt that this is not from God, or if you think Muhammad is making this up, you should be able to do this too. You are the masters of Arabic language. So produce a Quran like this. Or if you cannot produce the entire Quran, then produce 10 chapters or 10 surahs. Or even if that is not possible, then produce just one chapter or one surah. And it goes on to say that you, meaning the Meccans, you cannot produce any of that, even if you brought all the experts and anyone else to help you with this. Now let us look at some of the Quranic verses that mention this. In chapter 52, verses 33 to 34, the Quran says, "Or do they say, he, meaning Prophet Muhammad, has forged it?" That is this Quran. Nay, they believe not. Let them then produce a recitation or a Quran like it if they are truthful. And in chapter 2, verse 23, the Quran says, "And if you are in doubt as to what we, meaning God, have revealed from time to time to our servant, meaning Muhammad, then produce a surah like that of the Quran and call your witnesses or helpers if there are any besides God, if your doubts are true." In chapter 17, verse 88, the Quran says, "Say, if the whole of mankind and jinns were to gather together to produce the like of this Quran, they could not produce the like thereof, even if they backed up each other with help and support." Muslims believe that this challenge still exists. There is a fair bit of Islamic scholarly literature on this topic, but we don't have time to cover that now. Let us look at the issue of the Quran as a book. In this part of the lecture, let me just give you a very basic overview of how the Quran as a book, I mean a written text in the form of a book, came about. The timeline of its revelation is very brief. From 610 to 622 is the Meccan period, about 12 to 13 years, when the messages came in Mecca. And from 610 to 622 is the Meccan period, when the messages came in Mecca. And from 622 to 632 is the Medinan period, when the messages were received in Medina. From very early on, the Prophet was mindful of the fact that the Quran had to be preserved and protected. Although he himself could not read or write, he had followers who could, and they began to document some of the messages. They didn't document or write down the whole Quran, but only parts, perhaps many parts. In an oral culture, people depended on their memory. These days, of course, we cannot remember anything unless it is on our phone or in our calendar or in some kind of document. In that society, they had to rely on memory. It wasn't difficult for them to memorize large chunks of beautiful poetry or beautiful text. That's very common among Arabs. Today, there are Muslim kids, very young ones, who memorize the entire Quran by heart. It's a tradition that continues. And of course, during the Prophet's time, the Quran was regularly recited in daily prayers on a daily basis, and during Ramadan and on important occasions. So it was a live document that was continuously being recited and used. There was little room for it to be manipulated by people. But no complete written text of the Quran existed during the Prophet's lifetime. True, large chunks of the text were written down, but there was no single book that put together all those messages or revelations. The Quran was a text in progress during the Prophet's life. Messages, when received, were added to different parts of the Quran. The Quran could have been complete only after or at the time of the Prophet's death. In 632, the Prophet died, and within 2 years or so after the death of the Prophet, Muslim tradition says the first attempt at compilation of the Quran, that is, as a book of some sort, was made. There are lots of scholarly debates about this. Was it really a collection of some texts or some kind of exercise to put together some parts of the Quran? Or was it an attempt to put together the entire Quran? There are debates among Muslim scholars on this. The important thing is that later, between 650 and 653, the standard Quranic text was put together in Medina under the supervision of the third caliph or ruler, Uthman ibn Affan. That Quranic text is called the Uthmanic collection. The Caliph Osman was one of the colleagues and earliest followers of Prophet Muhammad, or as Muslims refer to them as one of the companions of the Prophet. So he was very familiar with the Quran from the very beginning. So the Quran as a written text, a complete text in written form or as a book, was made roughly within 20 years or so after the death of the Prophet by the very earliest followers of the Prophet who witnessed the revelation and experienced that during the Prophet's lifetime. The Quran as a written book therefore was established pretty early. In this process, Osman the Caliph asked a committee of first generation Muslims who were very familiar with the Quran to sit together and to go through every single bit of text they had in writing or in people's memory, of course, by asking people, and also by relying on their own memory and their own written materials collection. The committee comprised mostly of people who were with the Prophet, many of them from the very beginning, and some of them were involved in documenting the Quran during the Prophet's time. These people were the closest people you can think of as far as the Quran was concerned. The committee also listened to people who had memorized significant parts of the Quran or the entire Quran. After extensive work, they put together a document that they were happy with. If there was any disagreement about a particular text of the Quran, particularly how a word or phrase in Arabic was read by some Muslims or pronounced by some Muslims, that committee had to rely on the Arabic dialect of the Meccan people or the Qurayshi dialect, that is, the dialect of the tribe of Quraysh from which the Prophet came. The Qurayshi dialect is the Prophet's own dialect. In short, once the committee had done their research and put together the Quran as a book, the Caliph Osman himself went through the text and got views from various people in Medina in a consultation process. They all agreed that this was the standard text to be relied upon. The text was not distorted, nothing was added, nothing was dropped. So basically, this is supposed to be the complete text. Osman then asked a group of Muslims to. Osman then ordered Muslims in Medina or elsewhere. Osman then ordered Muslims in Medina or elsewhere to burn every bit of text they had of the Quran, whether those bits of text were or were not in the standard text. So basically, Osman unified the Muslim community or the Ummah, meaning community, around one standard text. This power of a single text resonates to this day among Muslims. Muslims, be they Sunnis or Shia or any other group, have the same Quran. This is the text we still have today, and this is the text we are studying in this subject. In Muslim tradition, you will find reports that certain companions of the Prophet or a few first generation Muslims had arguments with Osman, the Caliph Osman, about some minor aspects of the final and standardized text. For instance, there were questions about a couple of short chapters at the very end of the Quran as we have it, and whether they were actually part of the Quran or not. There was some disagreement as well about the ordering of some chapters, where some chapters should be. But there was no significant disagreement on the basic structure or the content of the Quran. There are different ways of reciting certain words or reading certain words. or the use of synonyms for other words, and the like. These minor variations reflect the various Arabic dialects at the time and continue to this day. These readings are accepted as part of the standard readings of the Qur'an. Osman's effort to put together the standardized text of the Qur'an unified the entire Muslim community around one single text. This is probably a very important achievement in the history of Islam. So, what are some of the scholarly debates around this issue of the Quran as a book? Let me just mention a couple of them. Some Western scholars of the Quran, that is in the modern period, have claimed that the Quran as we know it did not emerge until after 100 years or so after the Prophet. This is obviously a minority position even among Western scholars. The mainstream scholarly views among Western scholars tend to go along by and large with the Muslim narrative about the history of the Quranic text, with some differences obviously. For Muslims, the generally accepted view is what I have presented here. Let us now look at the Arabic script and the improvements made to the Arabic script to ensure that the Quran was readable. When the Quran was put together as a written book in the mid 7th century in Medina during the Caliph Osman's time, the Arabic script that was used for writing down the Quran was what we might call a defective script. What does this mean? It means it had lots of problems. The script had lots of problems. For example, some letters of Arabic are written exactly in the same way, and to differentiate between them, dots are added. But these dots did not exist at the time. That's a significant problem. This is the Arabic alphabet that we use till today. As you can see here, there are three letters, the ba and ta and tha. Without these dots, the three letters would have been written exactly in the same way, meaning in the 7th century. So without the dots, how would we know which is which? There is no way to know unless you look at the context of that letter, that is the word and the words next to it, and the sentence, and so forth and so forth. Imagine in English language if you had two letters, P and N. How would you read that in English? There are several possibilities. It could be pin, it could be pun, it could be pen, it could be pan. The same thing can happen in Arabic too if we don't have either the vowels or the dots. The Quran was initially written in a script that didn't have these dots. It didn't have vowels or endings. It didn't have full stops and it didn't have punctuation marks. Imagine how difficult it would be to read. It is also important to note that in the 7th century and beyond, by and large, Muslims relied on oral transmission of the Quran rather than relying on the written text. The written text was there as a backup, but people were learning the Quran memorizing the Quran by listening to recitation from a teacher rather than going to a book or a piece of paper. Of course, today we tend to read the book, but even then, in the case of the Quran, the tradition of the recitation and memorization and listening continues. The improvements to the script were by adding dots to differentiate different letters, by adding vowel markers like A, I, U. This is not about changing of the Quranic text or its content. It was simply a way of helping the very large numbers of Muslims, many of whom were not Arabic speaking, who wanted to learn to read the Quran. This is about improving the Arabic script, not about changes to the Quran. Without such improvements, it would have been very hard for many Muslims to read the Quran. From 661 to 680, that is still in the 7th century, some dots that function as grammatical markers were introduced. Between 685 and 705, still in the 1st century after the Prophet died, dots were introduced to differentiate between letters or different letters of the alphabet. In the 8th century, a more complete system of diacritical markers was introduced. So there was a gradual improvement of the Arabic script that went on for 2 to 3 centuries. Let us now have a look at the Quranic text at different times. This will show us how the script was being improved on. We'll look at some of the examples of Quranic texts from the earliest times to the present, but because of the time, we will be able to look at just a few examples. This is how the Quran might have looked like in the 1st century. As you can see, there are no dots or punctuation marks. But those of you who are familiar with the Quran or who have studied the Quran can see that this is part of this surah or that chapter. Then you can also start reading if you're familiar with that. If you're not familiar, it's very hard and almost impossible to read. This is another example from the 1st century of Islam. This is from one of the earliest Quranic manuscripts that we have. It's not a full manuscript, it's just a part of that. It is referred to as the Birmingham Quranic text. There's a lot of media interest in this particular piece, and if we have time, we can discuss that later. This is from the 8th to the 9th centuries. As you can see, there are a number of dots added. Some of these dots actually indicate the ending of a verse or a sentence. Some of them are related to the various letters of Arabic alphabet and so forth. So people can actually read the text a little bit easily than if they didn't have these dots. From the 9th century, again, pretty much as we saw in the other text, there are lots of dots, etc. It's an improvement again. Moving to the 13th century, as you can see here, dots are added, vowels are added, ending of the verses are indicated, and this is can be read relatively easily. This comes very close to a very modern Quran. This particular style of writing is found in North Africa. This is something that you notice also from when you look at the Quran from different regions. You have different styles of writing the script. The Indian subcontinent, the Egypt and other parts of the Middle East, and then later on, if you go to North Africa, this is the style of writing that you see. When I say style of writing, I mean the script. This is from the 20th century. It's, as you can see, all the dots and vowels are added, verse endings and verse numbers are indicated, and the same thing applies to this text, which is also very similar. Let us now look at the order of the revelations. This is about how the Quran is organized, how the chapters or surahs of the Quran are ordered or arranged from the longest to the shortest. In the Quran, as we have it, the arrangement is not chronological, that is, not according to how Prophet Muhammad received them. If you're trying to get a sense of the Meccan and Medinan parts of the Quran, you will find that the chapters at the very end of the Quran are all from the Meccan period. They are generally very short. Generally speaking, those at the very beginning of the Quran or the book are from the Medinan period, except for the very first chapter, which is Surah Al-Fatiha, we looked at early on in this lecture. What are some of the scholarly debates around the issue of the arrangement of the chapters? Well, Muslim scholars in the past looked at the issue of reorganizing the Quranic texts in chronological order, but they never produced a Quran organized like that. But some Western scholars of the Quran in the modern period have tried to do this. There are several attempts. but none of that seems very satisfactory to Muslims. If you try to order the Quranic chapters or the surahs chronologically, this is what you get. Chapter 1 will be what is known as chapter 96, as we have in the Quran. Chapter 2 will be chapter 68. Chapter 3 will be chapter 73, and so forth. So this is the traditional order, and this is the chronological order. The Quran as we have it is in the traditional order. This is an attempt at reorganizing the Quran, but as I said, this is not something that Muslims are very comfortable with. It's a scholarly attempt mainly by Western scholars. There is significant disagreement among Muslims about the order of the Quranic verses or the chapters of the Quran, because we don't have enough information that says very clearly that this verse is from this year or this period or that period. There are some parts of the Quran that are reasonably clear, like the chapters at the end of the Quran. They are clearly from Meccan period. There are chapters of the Quran that are also very clear that they are from the Medinan period. For example, the chapters that primarily deal with the conflicts between Muslims and others in Medina, for example, or between Muslims in Medina and their opponents from Mecca. But there are lots of Quranic chapters or verses or texts that are not very clear like this. So there is quite a bit of disagreement among Muslims and also non-Muslims about the chronological order of the chapters or the verses of the Quran. It would be possible to place the Quran in chronological order if we knew exactly when all the different verses were revealed. But we don't know that. We don't have enough information. Instead, we have to look at a few things like the style of the verse or the context or the topics the texts discuss, and then make a judgment. So we have to look for these indicators. Let us now look at the characteristics or the features of Quranic texts in the early to late Meccan periods. First, we'll look at the early Meccan period. The earliest verses the Prophet received are considered verses 1 to 5 of chapter 96. Another possibility is the chapter called the opening, or in Arabic, Al-Fatiha, the very first chapter of the Quran. Again, there is disagreement among Muslims on this. In the very early texts of the Quran, there are certain features or characteristics in terms of their language and style, which distinguish them from later texts. They tend to be shorter verses and chapters. They often use highly poetic language with features like rhyme, and they tend to have shorter sentences and a briefer style. This is one of the very short chapters at the very end of the Quran, and it reads, "In the name of God, most gracious, most merciful," and so on and so on. And if you look at the Arabic text, you can see that there is a dal at the end. Qul huwallahu ahad, Allahu samad, lam yalid wa lam yulad, wa lam yakul lahu kufuwan ahad. Very short sentences, and that time, although this is not poetry, you can notice that. So, what sort of topics or themes are covered in the earliest messages? You will find that there's a lot of talk about the end of times. For example, warnings and apocalyptic imagery of the coming judgment, like in chapter 81 of the Quran, verses 1 to 14. Let me read it for you so you can see what I mean. When the sun is shrouded in darkness, when the stars are dimmed, when the mountains are set in motion, when pregnant camels are abandoned, when wild beasts are herded together, when the seas boil over, when the souls are sorted into classes, when the baby girl buried alive is asked for what sin she was killed, when the records of deeds are spread open, when the sky is stripped away, when hell is made to blaze and paradise brought near, then every soul will know what it has brought about. Many early Meccan chapters or surahs open with oaths. Often they refer to cosmic phenomena such as creation of the sun, heavens, and stars. For example, you will see phrases like by the sun, or by the night, or by the stars. These are oaths. Often there are commands like read or say. Then there is also a lot of emphasis on issues like social justice. If you think about the context, this was a tribal society where some people were very rich and others were very poor. Orphans were neglected, and there were many who were disadvantaged in that community. So the Quran was addressing those issues. In fact, some of the very earliest texts of the Quran are about social justice. Let us look at chapter 104, for example. It says, woe to every slanderer, backbiter, who gathers wealth and counts it over, thinking that his wealth has made him immortal. By no means, he will be thrown into the crusher. This is one of the reasons why some of the very rich and powerful Meccans objected to the Prophet's message. They saw it as a threat to their wealth and status. This was a society that was moving from a nomadic to an urban or settled life. In this society, orphans, the poor, and many women were often neglected. There were also slaves that were often neglected and disadvantaged too. The Quran said this was wrong, and it addressed those issues very early on in the Prophet's teachings. In terms of style, the early Meccan verses tended to be very short, as I mentioned early on, and the chapters also tend to be short. But when we come to the Medinan period, they tend to be longer. And also late Meccan period, they tended to be longer. When you move towards the late Meccan period, the Quranic text becomes less poetic, with less of the condensed language we see in the early Meccan period. The theme, that is belief in one God, becomes very important and apparent in the later Meccan texts. Don't forget that when the Prophet Muhammad started teaching, although the idea of one God was very important, it was not necessarily the main topic of revelation. Recognition of God as the creator was very important. Of course, belief in the one God was also important, but its importance becomes very clear as we move on from 610 onwards. There are also recurring narratives of the persecuted prophets in later Meccan texts. The reason is that Prophet Muhammad himself was being persecuted, so these revelations reminded him and his community that other prophets had similar experiences, so he should be patient. There are also a lot of descriptions of paradise and hell during this period. Similarly, a lot of criticism of the opponents of the Prophet in Mecca exist in this period as well. Let us now look at the characteristics or features of the Quranic texts in the Medinan period very briefly. In Medina, things changed. The question is why? Remember, in Mecca, the Muslims were a persecuted minority. They didn't have control over very much. They were marginalized, and many of the Prophet's early followers were from a lower socio-economic background. In short, they were oppressed. In Medina, things changed. The Prophet settled there and established a political and religious community. In Medina, Muslims became the dominant community. So, in this context, they needed laws, rules, and regulations. Imagine if there wasn't a proper legal system, say in a country like Australia. People could not function. So it was important for the Medinan society, the Muslim society that was evolving, to have a set of laws and rules and regulations based on what the new religion needed or taught. Let me give some examples here. Chapter 2, verse 282 is an example of a legal prescription. It says, "O you who have believed, when you contract a debt for a specified term, write it down." There are also social prescriptions or social commands that were introduced in this period. In chapter 24, verse 27 to 33, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'll give you a sense of what the verse is all about. "O you who have believed, do not enter houses other than your own houses until you ascertain welcome and greet their inhabitants. That is best for you. Perhaps you will be reminded. And if you do not find anyone therein, do not enter them until permission has been given to you." And another example is, "Tell the believing men to lower their gaze and guard their private parts. That is purer for them. Indeed, God is acquainted with what they do." And tell the believing women to lower their gaze and guard their private parts and not expose their adornment. Lots of rituals were also introduced in Medina. For example, certain aspects of prayer or salah were formalized in the Medinan period, and other rituals like the pilgrimage and fasting also came from the Medinan period. Prayer towards chapter 2, verses 142 to 151 is about the direction of the prayer. And the Quran says, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but a part of that. "So turn your face towards the sacred mosque that is in Mecca, and wherever you are, turn your faces toward it in prayer." This is asking Muslims to face towards Mecca when they are praying, and this instruction or command came in Medina. Later Meccan and Medinan chapters also have many references to people like Abraham, Moses, and Jesus. Moses becomes very important in Medina. The question is why? There was a significant Jewish community in Medina, and there were struggles between the Muslims and the Jews, not in the very early period of Prophet's presence in Medina, but later on. Of course, there are lots of political issues involved. In these struggles, stories about Moses and how he was treated by his followers became very important. There are also direct and indirect addresses to the children of Israel in this context, referring to the Jewish community, or in Arabic, Banu Israel, meaning children of Israel. There are lots of references to the people of the book too. Well, who are the people of the book? Well, they are the Christians and Jews primarily. So, what are the benefits of understanding early and later texts or revelations? One of the benefits of understanding the early and later texts is that it helps you to contextualize the text. If you see a verse of the Quran dealing with an issue related to Muslim non Muslim relations, there is no need to jump to the conclusion that Muslims and non Muslims cannot have good relations. The text may be related to a particular incident that happened in Mecca or Medina. It may not be about how Muslims should behave towards non Muslims in general. The text may have to be understood in its specific context. Another example is that in our time, there is a great need for understanding topics like violence in the Quran or violence as expressed in the Quran properly. There are quite a lot of Muslims who take verses or texts from the Quran out of context and use them in ways that should not be used. Just because there is a Quranic verse on a particular issue, they may claim that this is what Muslims should do. But that may not be how great Muslim scholars or commentators on the Quran understood such a text. There may be many other texts in the Quran that may go against such a superficial understanding. We will explore these issues in later lectures. So, in summary, this lecture was about revelation and how understanding the period or the context in which a verse of the Quran was revealed can help you understand it better. The Prophet first received the Quranic messages in Mecca, But later, due to persecution, he had to migrate to Medina and continued to receive messages there. Although we don't have a list of or a summary of when and where certain verses of the Quran were revealed, the Meccan verses and Medinan verses tend to have certain characteristics that can help us work out in which context they were probably revealed. I covered some of the characteristics of early Meccan, late Meccan, and Medinan texts. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for more lectures in this series as we explore the Qur'an's history, themes, and interpretation, as well as related debates today. Subscribe and turn on notifications to catch the next lecture in the series.